Hey guys, what was the last really satisfying meal that you had? I bet it wasn't all that long ago. I bet maybe for many of you it was probably Easter. I know for me, we had the classic Easter dinner. It was, ham and mashed potatoes and lots of desserts and lots of pies and I think maybe there was a salad there, probably some dinner rolls. But after you get past ham and pies, I mean, what else is there to pay attention to? There's just something satisfying about eating until you're so full you feel like you can't get up from the table. Did you know that food kind of has a spiritual element to it? You walk through the Bible and you just see that food continues to show up in spiritual ways throughout it. Now, take, for example, our ancestors, Adam and Eve, all right? The first men and woman on this planet, and God places them in a garden where it specifically says he caused every good tree to grow for eating. They were surrounded by all the best food that they could have. And of course, what gets them kicked out and what dooms humanity to a life separated from God without the saving grace of Jesus? Well, you guessed it was eating that forbidden fruit. Take, for example, Elijah. When he was running from God, or not running from God, running from Jezebel and going to go see God down at Mount Horeb, and he's burned out, and what does he do? He falls asleep, and an angel wakes up and gives him spiritual food, a bread and drink that sustain him for a long period of time. We jump into the New Testament. And what about Jesus? Jesus' first temptation in the desert was to turn rocks into bread. And of course, his first miracle was turning water into wine. And remember, every 3 months or so, we sacrifice. We celebrate his sacrifice and the covenant that he forged with God by eating communion together. So you see, there's almost this spiritual quality to food. Now, going back to what we talked about on Sunday, we talked about where your heart is focused. We talked about heart focus. For the Israelites, and we looked at Numbers chapter 11, for the Israelites, their heart's focus was on food. It was on their stomach. It was on their own personal desires. And they had this rebellious complaining against God who had already provided so much for them. Interestingly enough, you'll find this interesting. It was a famine that drove the Israelites to Egypt. And after they left Egypt, after the Israelite people came out of Egypt into the desert, they ran into another famine of sorts. Exodus chapter 16 tells us that they had been out of Egypt for 2.5 months, and all of a sudden they don't have food. They run into this famine that would leave them dead within just a couple of days because there was no food in the desert at all. The Lord, of course, was not surprised by this. He was already planning ahead for this. He had this handled, and so he provided for the people. He was not going to let another famine drive them back to Egypt, which would have been spiritual death, or let them die in the desert. Instead, he provided with, you guessed it, a spiritual food called manna. He said in Exodus 16:4, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you." Now, before Moses died, he reminded the people of Israel about this. He says in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, he says, "And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." For the Israelites in the wilderness, food was everything to them. They were so focused on their own stomachs, so focused on their own desires, that they failed to see the spiritual connection that it held. Yes, God was providing for their physical needs, but he was also the answer to their spiritual nourishment. And when they left Egypt, they experienced a physical famine, but the spiritual famine was greater. And it had been going on for countless years already. And the only one who could fill that spiritual famine was God. And Jesus, when he was fasting in the desert, he put aside the physical food so that he could focus on the spiritual food of God. It wasn't a manna he could physically eat. It was being in the presence of God. It was, you might say, manna for the soul. This is one of the reasons God was so angry with those Israelites in Numbers chapter 11. They were denying the physical manna that God was providing them with, and in their actions of rebellious complaining, they were denying the spiritual manna he was providing as well. So how are you doing at pursuing spiritual manna? Is it a consistent part of your life, or are you seeking it only in emergencies? Are you spiritually fat, or are you spiritually starving? I can't answer that for you. That's something that you need to go before God and figure out.